Because of factors including the language barrier, transgenderism has been slow to spread here. And so feminists have been able to take advantage of the advanced warming that's come from abroad, from the gender critical movement. And I've had the luck to be here in Tokyo over the past year to see the emergence of a feminist resistance. And so today I'll describe some of the obstacles that language and its translation has posed to the spread of transgenderism in Japan, and has alternatively assisted its resistance amongst feminists. In many respects, though, Japan is no different from other countries in the rich capitalist world beholden to America, who are forced to adopt its ideologies. In many respects, the gender identity movement succeeds in Japan in exactly the same way it succeeds in countries abroad, and that is through hijacking the campaigns and the symbols and the groups and the festivals of gay liberation. So in this slide, we see a protest against anti-gay comments by a city councillor taking the form of appeals for individuals to decide their own sex. So the poster being held up there in Japanese is one sex should be self-determined. Leon Trotsky in 1938 described the reactionary politics at play in this kind of example. These politics take an irrelevant or inapplicable political formula and use it to conceal political activity towards goals directly contradicting those of the original formula. In the case of Japan, liberalism is only a weak political force here. So the formula not only conceals political activity in opposition to gay rights, but also obscures the fact that gay rights were never achieved in the first place in Japan. In other words, Japan is a place where transgenderism thrives on both illiberal political forces as well as their liberal flip side. And this is to say nothing, of course, of the status of women in Japan, which is, while it's not that of the Middle East, is still so low that Japan's gender pay gap is double that of Western countries, and rape conviction rates half. Further, gay liberation is only one of two political formulas that the gender identity movement uses in Japan. Different from other countries, here there exists a second zombie politics that is used in service of transgenderism. After the war, left-wing political parties, individuals and groups sponsored the enactment of eugenicist laws against leprosy patients, disabled people and people with cognitive impairments that ended up causing the sterilisation of 20,000 more victims who are mostly women, and apparently many more than 20,000 victims. The right-wing eugenicist movement from pre-war Japan that was based on ideas of racial blood purity was actually different from this post-war left-wing political eugenicist movement, but of course it caused the same outcomes. And these left-wing supported laws that were in the post-war period were finally abolished only in 1996, and the Japanese state is still tangled up in court cases and compensation schemes for victims today. Any technology having a connection to sterilisation, such as the pill, of course, abortion, the morning after pill, all of these issues, because they're connected to sterilisation, have trouble in Japan politically in terms of legislation and policy in general, even left-wing ground level politics. Of course, sex change surgery fits into this, and so because it results in sterilisation, so that was banned in Japan until 2003. However, in 2003, however, in response to, at that time, transsexualist demands, this law, sex change surgery, was deregulated in law with the support of the left, even with quite strict hurdles in relation to individuals not being able to be married or having children and various things. With the later advent of transgenderism, however, this law, and I do have to say that it was a compromise law that in its name actually has the phrase special exemption law because it was an exception, a rare exception in Japanese law to the original anti-eugenics law. But what happened in 2003 was that this law was enacted as a special exemption, even if a misguided one, in order to satisfy transsexual demands supported by the left. But now it forms a lightning rod for the later transgenderist movement, such as Western human rights organisations like Human Rights Watch, to now come into Japan and point to the law and say that Japan is uniquely transphobic. And elite academics within Japan, including a committee of the National Academy this year, capitalise on this kind of foreign influence coming in to turn themselves into big human rights defenders. And so they too join on this bandwagon of saying that Japan's uniquely transphobic because of this law requiring surgery. And their claim is correct. And I agree with Sheila Jeffries' comments made via the feminist webinars a while ago in relation to the need to absolutely oppose transgender surgeries and invasive medical practices. But the point I'm making is that it's ironic that progressives in Japan call for sex self-ID in reaction to a law they helped bring about, and they do so while concealing the historical connection of Japan's left to eugenics, as well as the 2003 deregulation of sex change surgery, plus the legal recognition of sex dysphoria in law. And these progressives say that sex self-ID is the only answer to Japan's supposedly abusive current law, which we know to have the exact opposite effect in terms of promoting transgender surgeries. And in my state of Victoria in Australia, we've had probably the world's most deregulating law in relation to the public record keeping over sex in birth certificates and things, at the same time that we're seeing more numbers now than ever coming into gender clinics in the public hospitals, and that's children coming in. But I know I've not said anything about language so far, but I'm going to talk about that now. And I think the language issues generally arise in relation to this situation that I've just described. For example, in 2019, a long-term American resident of Tokyo, married to a Japanese woman who's pictured here on the left, with 3 children, waged a public campaign against transphobia after being refused entry to a women-only event after showing official Japanese registration documents that were labelled female. These documents weren't forged because the individual had them prepared in Japan after procuring identity documents in one of the American states that that recognise gender identity. So in this case, transgenderist agitation in Japan succeeded because or through the importation and translation of identity documents from abroad that displaced Japanese domestic law and then contributed to campaigning against women-only space. This doesn't otherwise happen very much in Japan because only a few thousand people since 2003 have actually officially changed their sex in official documents, so they don't quite have the vehicle to do that kind of agitation usually. Other texts imported from abroad, such as English language academic books promoting the idea that transgenderism is indigenous to Japan, encourage these kind of incidents of agitation, in my view. Men with academic positions abroad lend support to gender identity movements in Japan, and Japanese language and cultural programs in Western countries routinely promote cultural products associated with the movement, such as animation and cosplay, and as we know, many of these are very pornographic. Japanese translated books, usually imported from English language books in America, are published for popular local consumption on genderist topics. And these books groom, I think, a conservative Japanese public in reactionary ideas about people being born in the wrong body. And obviously the Japanese public is deeply conservative, and so I think are very susceptible to such ideas. This year, a domestically published Japanese language comic book orientated towards children not only called sex a gradation, but also suggested it's a movable feast that can change daily between male, female, and unidentified. So this student in the cartoon is telling his teacher that today he's male, but he might be female tomorrow. Such ideas are not yet promoted in Japanese schools, but they do circulate in its elite city-based universities. This circulation has led to Japanese women-only universities. These are pre-war universities set up usually by missionaries or foreign missionaries groups. So they have a long history, but I think nearly all of them now have dropped their sex-selective admission policies in Japan, and that includes the two public ones. Applicants to these universities will usually be under the age of 20, and this is the minimum age in law to qualify for a sex change, and so these universities have effectively implemented their own sex self-ID policies. I think this situation is farcical because in the very year, around about 2018, that the universities overturned their selection policies, there was a big scandal that emerged of Japan's top university medicine departments implementing negative quotas against female applicants to hold their numbers down to 25%, which is really low. In Western countries now, we're getting 50% of applicants to medicine, entrance into medicine departments being female. A language-related issue that arose in relation to the success of transgenderism in Japanese universities came not from English language sources, but actually those of South Korea. So different from Japan, as women here will know, Korea has a strong radical feminist movement, and young women opposed an application for admission to the women-only Sukmyong University by a male applicant who had undertaken sex change surgery in Thailand. Their opposition successfully caused the withdrawal of his application. In Japan, though, news of his application was celebrated in the Japanese language press as progressive, and then when the student withdrew the application, it was reported in Japanese language media as yet another example of those Koreans being discriminatory and backward in their ideas of gender diverse people, because a lot of anti-Korean xenophobic stuff goes around in Japan. And so the very success of the feminist movement in Korea in achieving that win for women's sex-based protections in university education was completely missed. And so many, it's unfortunate that the feminist movement here in Japan unfortunately doesn't benefit from a lot of the successes of the South Korean sisters because of this issue of language and xenophobia. While Korean feminists face obstacles to influence in Japan, the Harry Potter series, on the other hand, is widely loved along with its author J.K. Rowling here and elsewhere in Asia. Her public statements earlier this year kickstarted the feminist resistance to gender identity in Japan because they gave local women who had already become sceptical of transgenderist demands as a result of that American action back last year. They gave those women who had become sceptical a feeling of legitimacy to speak out, and that really sparked the resistance here. It came from a provisional translation of the J.K. Rowling Writes About Her Reasons statement on Twitter by the Anti-Pornography and Prostitution Research Group quickly after it was published, and then a polished translation of that statement was published on this website on the screen, which is an initiative by anonymous women here in Tokyo, and they run two sites. This one is the international news, gender critical news site, and another one for local gender critical news and views in Japan.